The courtroom was packed. You could feel the tension hanging in the air like heavy smoke. People whispered, exchanged glances, and stared ahead at the man standing tall in his uniform. But this wasn't just any man. He was Colonel Elijah Ward, a black U.S. Army officer with 30 years of service, medals adorning his chest, and an unshakable presence that seemed to echo respect and dignity. No one knew why he was there exactly, only that it had something to do with his adopted son. But what happened next would leave the entire room stunned, flipping every assumption on its head. The moment a white cop approached the colonel, asked him to stand and clicked cold steel cuffs around his wrists, the room froze. You could hear a pin drop. Then within seconds the tide of that courtroom changed forever. What the colonel did next would not only challenge the cop's actions but would shake the entire system, right there in front of cameras, judges, and lawyers. What power did this man hold? And why did everyone moments later stand up in silence and awe? Welcome to Craft Tales, where we bring you real, gripping, and thought-provoking stories that don't just entertain, they open your eyes. If you're visiting for the first time, take a moment, like, share, and subscribe to join a growing community that believes stories matter. Because here's the question we asked today: what happens when power is misused against someone who holds real, quiet power of their own? This isn't just a story about one man in uniform. It's a mirror held up to society, about justice, race, authority, and the moments that define who we are. This channel exists to unpack those moments and breathe life into them. So stay with us, because this isn't just a story of confrontation. It's a story of honor, silence breaking, and the moment the whole room realized they had just cuffed a man who had commanded thousands, saved lives, and protected a nation. Yet in a courtroom, he was just another black man in handcuffs, until he spoke. Let's talk briefly about what unfolded before that courtroom showdown. Colonel Elijah Ward wasn't just attending court, he was standing as a guardian. His adopted teenage son, Marcus, had been involved in an incident at school, an incident that led to charges. The colonel wasn't there to plead for leniency. He was there to show the system what real fatherhood looked like. But what he walked into was far more hostile than expected. Some in the courtroom didn't recognize him for who he was. Others saw only the color of his skin and the uniform they assumed he wore for show. As he sat quietly observing, a white bailiff, Officer Jenkins, was reportedly tipped off by someone that the colonel was interfering with the case. What does that even mean? No one really knew. But Jenkins acted, publicly without cause, and escalated the situation. With all eyes watching, Jenkins handcuffed Colonel Ward right there in front of the judge. Some gasped. Others whispered. But Ward didn't resist. He didn't even flinch. He simply turned and looked Jenkins in the eyes, and what happened after would flip the entire courtroom on its head. Why does this matter? Because it reminds us of a truth we cannot ignore. Respect isn't always given, even when it's earned. And prejudice can show itself anywhere, even in places built to protect justice. Colonel Ward's story is powerful because it doesn't rely on outrage or violence. It reveals how calm authority, earned honor, and simple truth can sometimes be more powerful than any outburst. When Ward finally opened his mouth, he didn't shout. He didn't curse. He recited his service number, named his medals, and addressed the judge directly, not asking for justice for himself, but for every soldier who had ever stood in a courtroom and been judged before they were heard. The silence that followed was one of shame and realization. This moment matters because it exposes a broken piece of a system we often pretend is fine. And it shows us how one man's quiet strength can change a room, and maybe a few hearts, forever. So buckle up. Because in this video we're diving deep into the full story of Colonel Elijah Ward, from his military past, his bond with his son, and the moment he stood in that courtroom and flipped the script on a broken narrative. We'll follow what happened second by second. The whispers in the room, the reaction from the judge, the way lawyers scrambled, and the final words that made even Officer Jenkins step back and remove the cuffs. We'll also explore what happened afterward, the media explosion, the investigation, and the surprising response from the very system that tried to reduce him. Most of all, we'll tell this story with heart, facts, and purpose, because you deserve more than headlines. You deserve the truth behind the moment a black army colonel was handcuffed in court, and seconds later changed everything. This is more than a story. It's a moment that will stay with you. Let's begin. The courtroom was buzzing with low murmurs as people found their seats. It was just another routine hearing on a Wednesday morning, or so everyone thought. But within moments, the atmosphere would shift from mundane to explosive. Sitting quietly at the defense table was Colonel Darius Cole, a tall, commanding black man in crisp civilian attire, whose military bearing was unmistakable even in silence. His posture was straight, his eyes calm, but there was something in his stillness that hinted at deep awareness. He wasn't there as a defendant, nor as a witness. In fact, he had simply accompanied a friend as moral support. But someone in uniform didn't see that. They saw something else. And that misjudgment? It would cost them more than their pride. The officer stationed at the courtroom door was new to the assignment. Officer Brent Halley, a white cop transferred recently from another district. He was known for following rules to the letter, but often without context or compassion. When his eyes landed on Darius, a quiet unease took hold. Maybe it was the commanding presence. Maybe it was the skin color. Whatever it was, the moment Brent saw Darius speaking quietly with the public defender, a young black woman named Tiana Jacobs, he assumed trouble was brewing. Despite having zero indication of misconduct, Brent approached with authority that didn't fit the scene. "Sir, you can't stand there," he said sharply. Darius raised an eyebrow. "I'm just speaking with my friend." To Darius it was a simple conversation. To Brent it looked like defiance. Without verifying who Darius was, Brent asked for ID. Darius calmly explained, "I'm not involved in this case, officer. Just here as support." But Brent wasn't satisfied. He pressed again. "I need to see some identification." Darius, never one to stir trouble, reached slowly into his jacket and produced his Army ID card. It clearly stated his rank, Colonel. That should have ended it. But Brent's reaction was the opposite of expected. Instead of backing down, he scoffed. "That could be fake," he muttered. The room fell silent. Tiana's mouth dropped open. Darius remained calm, but there was steel in his gaze now. Brent reached for his cuffs. "You're interfering with a court process," he declared. "You need to come with me." A chorus of whispers erupted. "Is he serious?" someone murmured. Tiana stepped forward, her voice steady but laced with fire. "Officer, he is not interfering. He's a colonel in the United States Army. You're making a mistake." Brent ignored her. In one swift motion he grabbed Darius by the arm. Darius didn't resist, but the insult burned. As the cold metal clicked around his wrists, the judge banged his gavel in disbelief. "What is going on here?" he demanded. Brent spoke over him. "This man is being detained for interfering. Cameras in the courtroom, there for another case entirely, captured everything." The image of a decorated black Army colonel being handcuffed by a young white officer in open court sent a chill through the room. One juror visibly shook her head. A court clerk whispered, "He just handcuffed a colonel." But Brent, blind in his certainty, marched Darius toward the hallway. "You've got no idea what you just did," Tiana muttered. As Darius was led away, the courtroom watched silently, shame burning in many faces. But Darius's face? Still composed. Still proud. Because he knew something Officer Brent didn't. Down in holding, Darius sat quietly in a stark room. It wasn't the first time he'd been misunderstood, though this was certainly the most public. The silence pressed in, but his mind was still. He'd learned long ago not to react with rage. It gave people like Brent exactly what they were looking for. Meanwhile, above, chaos brewed. Tiana stormed into the judge's chamber. "Your Honor, I don't care what protocol is. That officer had no grounds to arrest him. This is beyond outrageous." The judge, clearly shaken, rubbed his temples. "Let me make some calls." Darius's military ID was quickly verified. And not just verified, flagged. Because Colonel Darius Cole wasn't just any officer. He held clearance few in the country ever attained. He had been decorated 5 times for acts of valor in active combat zones. He had advised Joint Chiefs. He had trained special forces. And worst of all for Brent? He had friends in high places. Very high. Within 20 minutes, a Department of Defense liaison was on the phone with the judge. "Release him. Now." But the humiliation had already taken root. The story was out. And it was spreading fast. Back in the courtroom, word trickled in. People began checking their phones. A local reporter in the gallery whispered, "Wait, that guy's a colonel? A real one?" Another replied, "More than that. He's one of the most respected soldiers alive." A courtroom marshal ran toward the hallway. Moments later, Brent emerged, red-faced, panicked, but still clinging to his duty. He unlocked the cuffs. "Sir, there's been a misunderstanding." Darius didn't say a word. He simply turned his wrists and massaged the indents left by the cuffs. His silence spoke louder than any accusation. Tiana stepped beside him. "You owe him more than that." The judge returned to the bench with visible anger. "Ladies and gentlemen, what occurred earlier was not only inappropriate, it was unacceptable." He looked directly at Brent, who now stood pale and motionless. "This man is not a suspect. He is a highly decorated officer in our armed forces. And this courtroom owes him an apology. A ripple of applause broke out. It wasn't protocol, but no one cared. For a moment, unity cut through shame. But Darius didn't acknowledge the applause. His dignity didn't need validation. He stood because he always had, long before this courtroom even knew his name. Outside, news cameras waited. The video had already gone viral. Colonel handcuffed in court without cause, blared across screens. Tiana leaned over and asked softly, "Do you want to say something to the press?" Darius shook his head. "Not yet. Let them tell their story first. Then I'll speak the truth." Meanwhile, Brent was escorted away for a formal debriefing. Internal affairs were already involved. But for many, this wasn't just about protocol. It was about perception, about how even in full honor, dignity, and lawful conduct, a black man could be shackled because someone thought they had the right. Later that afternoon, Darius finally gave a statement. Calm, clear, but unflinching. "I was handcuffed not because I broke the law, but because someone thought my presence was threatening. That says more about their fear than my conduct. I hold no anger, only disappointment. And I want to use this moment not to shame, but to teach." The press fell silent. There was no headline more powerful than truth told with grace. The clip aired nationally. Veterans across the country voiced support. Brent was suspended pending investigation. But Darius? He went back to service. Because that's who he was. But something deeper had changed. In schools, teachers played the courtroom video during social justice lessons. Recruiters for the military spoke of Colonel Cole as a model of restraint. In offices, the story sparked conversations about perception, power, and prejudice. One judge even cited the incident in a ruling about racial bias in law enforcement. The ripples spread farther than Darius ever intended. And yet, he never once sought vengeance. He didn't need to. The facts spoke volumes. His calm had flipped the room, not just the courtroom but an entire nation watching on screen. Brent, in the meantime, underwent mandatory training and was removed from public-facing roles. His apology came months later, private, direct, and filled with remorse. Darius accepted it. Not for Brent's sake but for the sake of progress. "Growth," he told him, "starts with accountability. You don't owe me anything, but you owe the next man you meet your full awareness." Brent nodded. And for the first time he listened. Whether or not he truly changed, only time would tell. But the seed had been planted. In a country often divided by misunderstandings and assumptions, Colonel Darius Cole had done something extraordinary. He had taken a moment meant to humiliate, and used it to elevate. He showed what true leadership looks like under pressure. He didn't fight with fists or fury. He fought with silence, honor, and the quiet conviction of a man who knows who he is. That day in court was no longer about a handcuffing. It became a story of contrast, between the smallness of prejudice and the magnitude of dignity. And the people remembered. For once, a viral clip didn't just spark outrage, it sparked change. Darius didn't ask to be a symbol, but he became one. A walking reminder that justice isn't about uniforms or titles, it's about how we treat one another when no one is looking, and when everyone is watching. What Brent saw as control, Darius turned into character. And that, dear viewers, is how one man flipped a room, not with rage but with righteousness. The courtroom air turned thick the moment Officer Chad Bronson clicked the cuffs on Colonel Elijah Grant. It wasn't just the metallic clang that echoed, it was the gasp that rippled through the gallery. The judge, startled mid-sentence, looked up as if someone had just slapped the Constitution across his bench. A decorated black colonel in full military dress was now being treated like a common criminal, in front of a room filled with lawyers, civilians, and cameras. The silence was deafening. Grant stood motionless, his spine as rigid as a parade salute. He didn't protest. He didn't flinch. He simply raised his eyes toward the bailiff who stood frozen in disbelief and whispered, "Is this how justice is rendered now?" It was a line that would echo louder than any gavel. Officer Bronson, however, seemed unfazed. In his mind, this was about authority and control. He had misinterpreted the colonel's quiet but firm presence as defiance. Grant's dignified demeanor, his commanding tone when he addressed the court earlier, had made Bronson feel overshadowed. His decision to handcuff the colonel had less to do with law and more to do with ego. He leaned close and muttered, "You may be a big shot in the army, but in here, I give the orders." What he didn't know, what the entire room was about to discover, was that Elijah Grant didn't need a badge to command a room. His authority came from something deeper, earned, not given. The judge cleared his throat. "Officer Bronson, I wasn't aware that a detainment order had been issued." His voice was cautious, almost afraid of what he had just witnessed. Bronson stood tall, assuming he could justify his actions. "He was disrupting proceedings, Your Honor." I interpreted his posture as threatening. Several jurors raised their eyebrows. One whispered, "Threatening?" The man hadn't moved in 10 minutes. The prosecution team exchanged uneasy glances. The defense attorney, a young woman named Samantha Yu, stood up abruptly. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I object to this clear abuse of power and demand an immediate explanation. This man is a colonel, a national hero. He was offering testimony, not resistance." That's when Elijah's wife, Monique, who had been seated in the second row, stepped forward. Her eyes were welling up, but her voice was steel. "Do you know how many nights I prayed he'd come home safe from Iraq? From Afghanistan? From leading rescue operations in disaster zones you only hear about in passing? And today the threat isn't a battlefield, it's a courtroom in the very country he swore to defend." Her words were not dramatic. They were raw. "True." The gallery murmured. Even those unfamiliar with the colonel were starting to feel something rise in their chests: rage, confusion, and an unbearable shame. The judge began to review Grant's file, his eyes widening with each line. Multiple medals, leadership honors, citations from presidents, Democrat and Republican alike. There was no record of misconduct, no disciplinary action, not even a parking violation. The only stain in that moment was the glint of handcuffs on a man who had served this country with dignity. The gallery began to stir. Phones were raised. Cameras started to roll. Reporters who had come to cover a civil case now realized they were witnessing a public miscarriage of justice. Officer Bronson began to shift, his confidence eroding beneath the weight of dozens of eyes. Then came the moment that turned the courtroom cold. As Bronson tightened his grip on Grant's arm, something slipped from the colonel's pocket and hit the floor. A dull thud echoed. It was a small black box, the kind used to hold ceremonial honors. Curious, the judge leaned forward. "What's that?" Elijah, still restrained, turned his head slowly. "That is the Presidential Medal of Valor." Gasp. Audible gasps. The judge blinked in disbelief. "Samantha, you nearly dropped her briefcase." "And Bronson?" His hand trembled as he stepped back. "The Medal of Valor is not just rare, it's sacred. It's awarded only to those whose heroism is considered legendary, often posthumously." The courtroom went still. It was as if time froze to pay respect to what had just been revealed. The judge ordered the medal to be brought forward. When he opened the case, the golden light reflecting from the medal felt almost spiritual. "Colonel Grant," the judge began, his voice cracking, "is this authentic?" Elijah nodded. "Awarded 3 years ago. Operation Iron Sentinel. We lost 5 men that day. I stayed behind to carry the 6th. His voice did not break. It didn't need to. The silence said enough. Even Officer Bronson's mouth fell open slightly. He hadn't just cuffed a soldier. He had shamed a man who carried the memory of fallen heroes in every step. A slow, almost involuntary clap came from the gallery. One, then another, until the entire courtroom was applauding. The judge didn't stop it. He didn't dare. It wasn't just applause, it was an apology in action. A recognition of truth too long buried beneath bias. Elijah was finally uncuffed, and as the cold steel fell away from his wrists, it wasn't just physical restraint being removed. It was symbolic. The judge looked at Bronson and said in a sharp, authoritative tone, "You are dismissed from this courtroom pending further investigation." Bronson didn't argue. He walked out silently, his authority dismantled in front of a crowd that would never forget what happened. As Elijah returned to the witness stand, there was no bitterness in his eyes. Just purpose. "I didn't come here to cause trouble," he began. "I came to speak truth. But it seems even truth has to fight its way through chains." His words hung in the air like banners of justice. The jury leaned in. Reporters scribbled like mad. What had begun as a routine hearing had transformed into a national reckoning. Monique took her seat again, her hand gently resting on her chest, where her husband's medal had rested moments before. And the judge? He sat back, quietly aware that this day would be studied in law schools and history classes alike. Outside the courthouse, news vans had already begun to arrive. Hashtags were trending. Hashtag Colonel in chains. Hashtag Valor on trial. But inside that chamber of marble and silence, something greater had unfolded. Respect. Redemption. And a reminder that in a courtroom as in life, assumptions can be deadly, but truth will always fight its way to the surface. The story of Colonel Elijah Grant wasn't over. In fact, it had just begun. But one thing was clear. From that moment on, no one in that room would ever see a uniform or a man in handcuffs. The same way again. As the cuffs clicked around Colonel Raylan Carter's wrists, the entire courtroom fell into an eerie silence. Everyone had expected a dignified presence, maybe even some formal tension, but what unfolded was beyond imagination. Even the judge, who had remained indifferent earlier, now leaned forward with visible discomfort. Carter, however, stood calm. That was the first thing that caught people off guard. The courtroom guard, Officer Trent Holloway, was still gripping the colonel's arm, but his demeanor shifted subtly, sensing something was off. Raylan's military posture didn't break. His eyes scanned the courtroom, not in fear but in deliberate assessment. He locked eyes with the judge. Then softly he said, "You just made a grave mistake, sir. But not against me, against every soldier in this country who ever wore this uniform." That sentence echoed like thunder in the silence. Murmurs started among the courtroom audience. Some recognized him now, not from news, not from controversy, but from old newspaper clippings, medals awarded on live television, memorial events. A few began to whisper, "Is that Colonel Carter? The Delta Force veteran?" The judge shifted in his seat, suddenly unsure. The room wasn't just watching a man in cuffs anymore, they were watching a warrior about to reclaim his dignity. Raylan raised his cuffed hands calmly and asked the judge for permission to speak. The judge, perhaps out of guilt or fear of the growing murmurs, granted it. "You see these medals on my chest?" Raylan began, voice steady but firm. "They're not decorations, they're blood, sweat, and lives I carry for those who never made it home." He took a moment, letting the words sink in. Then, turning slightly to Officer Holloway, he continued, "And to be treated like a criminal in the very country I risked everything for, it doesn't shame me. It shames this room." The atmosphere cracked open like a dam bursting. From the back of the courtroom someone stood up. It was a veteran. Another rose beside him. Then another. Within moments, nearly a dozen spectators were on their feet. Some saluted. Some had tears. The courtroom transformed from a place of judgment into one of reckoning. The judge looked pale. Officer Holloway loosened his grip. The courtroom clerk, who had typed away dutifully earlier, stopped and watched, visibly shaken. The courtroom was no longer in control of its own narrative. Colonel Carter had taken over. "I fought so others could judge fairly," Raylan continued. "But if this court can't see past skin color, then everything I did overseas means nothing." His words weren't just an indictment of the cop who cuffed him, they were aimed at the whole structure. A young woman in the jury, no older than 23, wiped her eyes. The bailiff stood frozen. Then Raylan did something nobody expected. He listed names. Names of his fellow soldiers. Private Jenkins. Sergeant Alvarez. Captain Marcy. They died protecting the Constitution you just mocked. His voice didn't rise, but each word carried weight, like a hammer hitting cold iron. Then came the tipping point. From the side door, another person entered, a woman in uniform. Major Simmons. She walked directly to the bench and handed the judge a folder. "You may want to read this before this embarrassment goes any further," she said coldly. Inside the file, classified commendations, top-secret missions, and a personal letter from a former president thanking Raylan Carter for stopping an international crisis. The judge's jaw dropped. The courtroom exploded into stunned gasps. The judge stammered, suddenly realizing the scope of his error. "Colonel Carter, I wasn't aware." "You didn't need to be," Raylan cut in, voice still low. "All you needed was to treat me as an American." The truth in his words struck like lightning. The judge turned red, then pale again. He ordered the cuffs removed immediately. Officer Holloway hesitated, but then quietly unlocked them. Raylan rubbed his wrists slowly, not out of pain, but to reclaim the space that had been violated. "This isn't just about me," he said, turning to face the public. "This is about every man and woman who wears the uniform and comes home to a system that forgets them." A young reporter in the crowd who had originally come to cover a tax dispute now stood up, pen shaking. "Sir, may I ask you a question?" Raylan nodded. "What do you want the world to know?" she asked, voice cracking. The colonel paused for a moment. Then, "That strength isn't just on the battlefield, it's having the grace to stand tall when others try to make you kneel." The media rushed outside. News vans arrived within minutes. What had started as a routine court hearing now ignited national headlines. "Colonel Carter speaks out on courtroom injustice," read one ticker. Social media exploded with footage, clips of veterans saluting, of the courtroom rising to its feet, of the judge visibly ashamed. Major Simmons remained beside Raylan, eyes firm, making it clear he wasn't alone in this. Calls came in from the Pentagon, from news agencies, from civil rights groups. This wasn't a minor misunderstanding anymore. It was a reckoning. But for Rayland it was never about fame or revenge. As he exited the courtroom, he walked past the crowd without lifting his chin too high or letting a smirk touch his face. He nodded humbly at the veterans, shook hands with the bailiff who had tears in his eyes, and quietly said, "Thank you for seeing me today." The humility struck even deeper than his words inside. That day the world didn't just meet a colonel. They met a leader. Outside the courthouse, a line of supporters gathered, many of them veterans, some civilians, some children holding hand-drawn signs that read, "Thank you, Colonel." Rayland didn't expect a parade, but he got one anyway. Journalists shouted questions, but he paused only for one. "What's your message to young black men watching today?" Rayland looked directly into the camera. "You are more than what this world assumes of you. Wear your truth like a badge, not your shame." The crowd cheered. A mother lifted her son onto her shoulders so he could see. A tearful father hugged his daughter tightly, whispering, "This is history." Rayland made his way down the steps, greeted by fellow soldiers who stood in a quiet salute. It wasn't about race, but race had been used to shame him, and now, through honor, he'd reversed the wound. A community wounded by bias had found healing in one man's strength. The white cop who had cuffed him watched from behind the glass. Maybe he saw now. Maybe not. But something had changed. Something undeniable. The Department of Justice launched an inquiry within 48 hours. The judge released a statement apologizing for what he called a severe lapse in decorum and judgment. Officer Holloway was placed on leave, pending an internal review. But the focus wasn't on retribution, it was on reflection. News outlets replayed Carter's words on loop. Civil rights leaders quoted his speech at rallies. School teachers shared the story with students to explain courage and dignity. And Rayland? He returned home not with fanfare, but to his small apartment overlooking a quiet field. He spent the evening writing letters to the families of the soldiers he named in court. Their sacrifice had carried him through, and he wouldn't forget. Later that week a senator called. Then another. Then the president's office. They wanted him to speak at the National Veterans Summit. Rayland agreed, but only on one condition: "Let me bring the people this system forgets. The ones who stood with me in silence before the world finally listened." On stage at the summit, before thousands, Rayland stood without rank, without uniform. Just a man, and that was enough. Behind him stood a row of veterans from every background, every branch. "Today," he began, "we're not rewriting laws. We're reminding America who keeps them upright." His speech was televised across the country. Parents sat with their children. Former service members sat taller in their chairs. In homes, schools, barbershops, churches, people watched and remembered. And as Rayland stepped down from that stage, a boy ran up to him with a crayon drawing. It was a picture of a courtroom with a man in cuffs standing proud. At the bottom, the child had scribbled, "My hero." Rayland knelt, took the drawing and smiled. "You got the story right," he said softly. And that, in the end, was all he ever wanted, to be seen. Truly seen. As the courtroom slowly returned to silence, every soul present felt the shift, not just in the room but in themselves. The weight of what had transpired, what had been exposed, settled like morning fog that couldn't be ignored. Colonel Marcus hadn't just turned the tables, he'd reshaped the entire courtroom dynamic. Judge Rowley, flushed and humbled, leaned forward with a solemn look on his face. "Colonel," he began, his voice softer than it had been all day, "this court owes you more than an apology. We owe you our respect." That sentence, short but seismic, brought many to tears. It wasn't just about one man being wronged, it was about the truth stepping out of the shadows, and demanding to be seen. The officers who had once smirked at Marcus now stood straight-backed, ashamed. And the cop who handcuffed him? He couldn't even meet his eyes. The reversal was complete, and it was powerful. Outside, the courthouse was surrounded. News vans, protesters, veterans, and curious citizens gathered, buzzing with the urgency of something much bigger than a headline. When Marcus finally stepped out those courthouse doors, the crowd erupted into applause. He wasn't just a military colonel anymore. He had become a symbol. A symbol for everyone who had ever been doubted, overlooked, or disrespected simply because of the color of their skin. A young black boy in the front of the crowd raised a homemade sign. "My hero wears combat boots, not a cape." Marcus saw it and his eyes welled up. This wasn't the legacy he had planned, but it was one he now carried with pride. Reporters rushed him with questions, but he held up a hand and spoke clearly. Today wasn't about revenge. It was about respect. about the power of standing tall when the world tries to bend you. The aftermath rippled out far beyond the courtroom walls. The officer who had handcuffed Marcus was suspended pending a full review. Internal Affairs launched a full investigation. Policies began to change quietly behind the scenes, including in courtrooms across the state. Several judges issued statements about racial bias and institutional reform. One even stepped down voluntarily. Judge Rowley, surprisingly, wasn't one of them. Instead, he launched an initiative alongside Marcus to hold annual town halls focused on justice and race. At first, people were skeptical. But when Marcus accepted the invitation, not for Rowley's sake but for the people, attitudes began to shift. Healing didn't come easily, but it had to start somewhere. And it started with accountability. For Marcus, life took on new meaning. He was now speaking at high schools, universities, and community centers. His story was not just being told, it was being studied. People wanted to understand what it meant to fight for your country abroad and still have to defend your dignity at home. One evening, after speaking at a local youth camp, a teenage girl approached him. "I want to join the military," she said, "because you reminded me that we belong there too." That hit him hard. Not because it was flattering, but because it meant the next generation was listening. If his pain, his humiliation, and his strength could inspire someone to rise, then maybe it had all been worth it. As for the courtroom, it didn't forget. Every time Marcus walked in after that day, whether to speak, observe, or advocate, the room stood up. It wasn't a rule. No one had asked them to. But out of respect they rose. His reputation became untouchable, not because he sought revenge, but because he had shown restraint in the face of rage. Honor in the face of insult. That's what flipped the room. Not anger. Not rank. But dignity. The kind that can't be pinned to a uniform, the kind that can't be silenced by handcuffs. The kind that forces people to rethink what justice really looks like. Now let's take a moment to reflect. What does this story tell us, not just about the system but about ourselves? How often do we judge someone based on how they look or what they wear? How quick are we to follow orders without asking if they're just? Colonel Marcus didn't need revenge. He needed recognition. And in that courtroom he didn't just get it, he earned it under pressure with grace. That moment taught us that change doesn't always come through noise. Sometimes it comes through stillness. Through a man standing calmly even while chained. Through a truth that echoes louder than any gavel ever could. To everyone watching this on Craft Tales, thank you for staying with us through this unforgettable story. Stories like these aren't just headlines, they're life lessons. They're mirrors. And maybe, just maybe, they're catalysts. If this story moved you, challenged you, or opened your eyes, we invite you to do something simple, yet powerful. Share it. Let someone else hear the echo of that moment in court. Let someone else be inspired by Marcus' courage. Because the more we tell these stories, the more we break the cycles of silence. So before we go, let me ask you, what would you have done in that courtroom? Would you have spoken up? Would you have stood beside him? Let us know in the comments below. And if you believe in the power of truth, respect, and storytelling, hit that like button. Share this video. Subscribe to Craft Tales for more incredible stories that deserve to be heard. Because truth, when told right, doesn't just inform, it transforms. And with your voice added to ours, we can make sure that no story like Colonel Marcus ever goes unnoticed again. Until next time, stay bold, stay aware, and stay inspired.